Kingsley estate loomed like a shadow on the horizon, its silhouette jagged against the pale morning sky. I remember the first time I saw it, not as a child, but as a young adult, ignorant of the whispers that trailed the name Kingsley. My aunt had sent for me, a letter heavy with cautionary undertones, urging me to come, to see what had been passed down in our bloodline. The letter itself was peculiar, written on yellowed paper with ink that seemed to resist the years, each word deliberate, each pause hinting at unspoken truths. I could not have imagined that stepping onto the gravel path leading to that house would mark the beginning of a journey I would never return from unscarred. The estate had been abandoned for decades before my arrival. The windows, long neglected, bore the weight of dust and shadow, and the gates, rusted and creaking, opened with an ominous groan that seemed almost alive. Every step toward the house felt like crossing an invisible boundary, a line between the ordinary world and something older, something unyielding. The locals, when asked about the Kingsleys, would avert their eyes. Some muttered about the curse, others simply shook their heads, as if the very mention of the family was a sin. My aunt, now frail and silent, had only one warning: do not touch what you are not meant to. Inside, the air was thick with decay and memories that refused to fade. The grand hall, with its once lustrous wooden floors and towering ceiling beams, felt hollow, echoing every sound like a warning. I ran my hand along the banister, feeling its cold, splintered surface, and a shiver ran down my spine. Portraits of stern, unsmiling ancestors lined the walls. Each face seemed to observe me, judging, waiting, and somewhere beneath the solemn gazes, I felt it, the first brush of the curse. It wasn't immediate, not like a scream in the night. It was subtle, a weight pressing against my chest, a whispered chill that crawled along my spine. The Kingsleys had always been a family of wealth, influence, and secrecy. History books praised them for their philanthropy, their ventures across oceans, their legacies in business and politics. But the stories the locals told were different. They spoke of madness, of despair, of children who vanished, of marriages that ended in ruin. And every story, every single one, seemed to end with the same word: curse. I laughed the first time I heard it, attributing the tales to superstition, exaggeration, the fear that grows in empty towns where history festers unchecked. Yet as I walked the halls, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the house itself had a memory, and that memory was not kind. On my first night I could hear the whispers. They were faint, indistinct, curling around the edges of sleep, intruding like shadows at the corner of vision. I tried to dismiss them, telling myself that the wind through the broken windows, the groan of settling beams, was enough to explain the sound. But then a cold breath, unmistakably human, grazed my ear. I woke with a start, heart pounding, but no one was there. The house was silent, almost smug in its stillness. I did not sleep well again for days. Every night, the whispers returned, growing clearer, forming words I could not comprehend, yet somehow understood. You are of us now. You cannot leave. It was in the library that I discovered the first tangible trace of the curse. A small chest, tucked beneath the massive oak desk, its hinges rusted, its lock broken. I had no reason to open it, yet my fingers itched, driven by curiosity I would later regret. Inside lay letters, dozens of them, written in tight, careful handwriting that spanned generations. Each one spoke of misfortune, of accidents, of sudden deaths that claimed family members without warning. Reading them, a pattern emerged, a lineage of sorrow, meticulously chronicled, each tragedy more harrowing than the last. One letter described a young girl, her name struck through with black ink, found lifeless in the garden, her eyes wide with terror. Another spoke of a husband who went mad, chasing invisible enemies, through the halls until his body was discovered at the foot of the stair. As the sun rose and fell, the house seemed to respond. Shadows shifted unnaturally, stretching long and narrow, twisting around corners, following me. I began to see movement in the corners of my eyes, fleeting figures that vanished when I turned. The portrait's eyes seemed to glimmer with unholy life, the brushstrokes concealing not artistry, but intent. And always, the whispers, so persistent, so intimate, as if the house itself knew my name. You belong here. You cannot leave. By the third night, I realized the truth. The curse was not a myth. It was real. And it was in me, in my blood, inherited from ancestors who had once thought themselves immune. Each Kingsley had tried to defy it, to break free from the pattern of despair, but the letters proved the futility. Attempts to escape only led to new tragedies. One tried to flee to another continent, only to perish at sea. Another sought solitude in the mountains, never to be found again. The curse was not a thing that could be defeated by logic or strength or distance. It was woven into the very fabric of our lineage, a shadow that lived, breathed, and waited. I thought about leaving, about abandoning the estate and my family name altogether, but the weight of heritage, of history, of blood, is not so easily dismissed. The Kingsleys, for better or worse, had carved their names into time, and to walk away was to betray not only my ancestors but myself. And so I stayed. I read the letters, one after another, each a testament to the inescapable fate that awaited all who bore the name. With every story, the whispers grew louder, no longer mere background noise but a chorus of lamentation, warning, and expectation. By the end of the first week, I understood something that chilled me to my core. The curse demanded acknowledgement, recognition, perhaps even reverence. To ignore it was to invite it in closer, to let it fester until it consumed all reason. The house, the letters, the shadows, the whispers, they were all parts of the same entity, a single living testament to centuries of despair, and I was now part of it, whether I liked it or not. The Kingsley estate was more than a home. It was a mirror, reflecting the failures, fears, and fatal flaws of those who had come before. And as I sat in the library, the letters spread around me, I felt a cold certainty settle in my chest. My life would never be ordinary again. The inherited curse had chosen me, and there was no turning back. Not now, not ever. The next morning, I ventured deeper into the estate, compelled by both dread and fascination. The main hallway branched into corridors I had not dared explore the night before, each leading to rooms filled with furniture, shrouded in dusty sheets, forgotten relics of lives once lived, and portraits whose eyes seemed more watchful than ever. The air was heavier here, almost tangible, as if the walls themselves bore the weight of centuries of suffering. The whispers from the night had not ceased. Now, during the daylight hours, they felt like a subtle hum beneath my skin, reminding me that the curse was never idle, never sleeping. I discovered the nursery first, a room frozen in time. The furniture was small, delicate, and coated in layers of dust. A cradle sat near the window, its once white paint now chipped and gray, and inside it lay nothing but shadow. Yet, as I approached, I could sense a presence, a lingering echo of life that had long since ended. The air was tinged with an invisible coldness, and I could almost hear the faintest cry, like a whisper lost among the cracks of the wooden floor. The letters I had found in the library returned to my mind, the stories of children lost, taken before their time, victims of accidents that seemed too precise, too cruel to be mere chance. I moved on, following a corridor lined with portraits of Kingsleys long dead, their faces twisted slightly in the flickering light, expressions of pride or malice, or perhaps both. One portrait in particular caught my eye, a young man in a dark velvet suit, his gaze sharp and penetrating. There was something familiar about him, a sense of recognition that made my stomach knot. I reached out, and my fingers grazed the canvas. Immediately the room seemed to shudder, a low groan resonating from the walls. I pulled back instinctively, and the whispers rose again. Urgent now. Insistent. I realized then that the curse was not only bound to objects, letters or rooms. It was bound to memory, to lineage, to those who dared to engage with it. The dining hall was vast, its long table covered in a thick sheet, as though the house itself tried to hide the gatherings that had once taken place there. I imagined the Kingsleys of old, seated in rigid formality, discussing matters of fortune, alliances and power, all while shadows of doom lingered at their shoulders. The chandelier above was coated in cobwebs, crystals dulled by decades of neglect, yet it seemed to hum faintly, like a heartbeat trapped in amber. I ran my hands along the table's surface, and felt the grooves and scratches of countless meals, countless conversations, countless moments that had shaped the family, and perhaps shaped the curse itself. It was in the West Wing that I found the first evidence of rebellion against the curse. A small study tucked away behind a false door. Books lined the shelves, each one meticulously annotated with notes in margins, some in English, others in languages I barely recognized. The author, a Kingsley of the previous century, had attempted to catalogue the family's misfortunes, to understand the patterns, the triggers, the way the curse unfolded across generations. His handwriting was frenzied in places, neat in others, reflecting a mind oscillating between despair and determination. It became clear that even then, the Kingsleys had known the curse was no mere superstition. They had tried to confront it, to escape it, yet they had all failed. Among the books, I found a journal bound in worn leather. The entries chronicled life in the house in a way that letters could not. The small daily horrors that gradually built into something insurmountable. One entry described a family dinner, where the patriarch had suddenly fallen ill, clutching his chest, as if an invisible hand had struck him. Another recounted a servant who had vanished, leaving only a pool of water and a faint scent of decay behind. The journal's final entry was a warning, written in trembling ink. Do not trust the walls. Do not trust the air. The curse watches those who seek to defy it. As the day turned to evening, the estate's atmosphere changed again. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching across the floors and walls, entwining with one another. The whispers grew louder, not in sound but in sensation, pressing against my mind, tugging at memories I did not know I possessed. It was then I realized that the curse was not merely a punishment. It was an education, a reminder of the weight that came with the Kingsley name. Every tragedy, every madness, every sudden death had been a lesson in humility, in caution, in the recognition that bloodlines bear burdens beyond comprehension. Night fell, and I could no longer ignore the presence of something more than memory or history. It was in the shadows, in the corners, in the hush between my footsteps. The curse had grown impatient, and I could feel its gaze probing, calculating. I dared not sleep, for I knew that rest would leave me vulnerable. Instead, I sat in the study, poring over the journal, trying to understand, trying to find a pattern, a loophole, a clue that might spare me the fate of my ancestors. The air grew colder still, and I wrapped myself in the thin blanket I had brought, as if mere cloth could ward off the centuries of despair that inhabited this house. Hours passed, and exhaustion mingled with fear, until I could barely distinguish between waking and dream. The whispers now formed words I could barely comprehend, fragments of sentences that seemed both urgent and mocking. You cannot leave. You will belong. You are chosen. My heart raced, and I realized that the curse was not simply a tale of misfortune. It was a claim, staking its right over all who bore the Kingsley name. It was possessive, sentient, and unyielding. By dawn I had learned two things with terrible clarity. First, that the curse was living, breathing, and aware of my presence. Second, that no amount of logic, reason, or courage could undo it. The estate, the portraits, the journals, the whispers, they were all components of a single entity, and I had become entwined within it. I was not a visitor. I was a participant, a witness, a target, and a bearer of history all at once. The Kingsley curse was as much a part of me now as my own pulse, and I understood that this was only the beginning. I stepped out into the cold morning air,
the first light of day casting the estate in an almost deceptive warmth. The gravel crunched beneath my feet, yet the whispers lingered, echoing in my mind even as the wind carried them away. I knew then that the rest of the house awaited, that every room, every hallway, every secret held revelations I was not yet ready to face. The curse had marked me, and the journey of understanding and surviving, it had only just begun. The deeper I ventured into the estate, the more I realized that the curse did not merely haunt the living. It lingered in the very structure of the house itself. Walls, floors and ceilings bore marks of events I could only imagine: scuffs from hurried footsteps, gouges where something or someone had clawed at the wood, and the subtle sagging of beams that seemed to bend under the weight of unspoken horrors. The Kingsleys had lived and died here, but the estate had absorbed them, and their memories, grief and madness had become a part of its very bones. I made my way to the west wing, where the family's private quarters lay. Here the air was denser, almost viscous, and it clung to my lungs, making each breath a conscious effort. The corridors twisted unnaturally, or perhaps it was my perception, distorted by the house's subtle manipulation. Portraits of past generations lined the walls, their eyes tracking me with an intensity that bordered on accusatory. I stopped before one of the portraits, a young woman, her face pale and pinched with worry. I could almost see the terror she must have felt, knowing what was coming yet powerless to stop it. There was a note attached to the frame, yellowed and brittle. I read it carefully. She tried to run. The walls did not allow it. The bedroom doors were all closed, some locked, some simply hanging on rusted hinges. I chose one at random, sensing that the choice itself was meaningless. The curse did not discriminate. Inside, the room was small and unremarkable, save for a child's bed pushed against the far wall. The sheets were torn, and in the corner, a small rocking horse had been abandoned mid-motion, as if the child had fled and never returned. The air carried a faint, almost imperceptible scent of perfume and decay. I shivered, aware that the room remembered, and that its memories were not gentle. As I explored, I found a wardrobe that had been left ajar. Inside were clothes that belonged to generations of Kingsleys, tiny dresses, faded jackets, hats with feathers still clinging to the seams. Each item seemed to vibrate with residual energy, whispers of laughter and sorrow intertwined, blending into a quiet, relentless hum. I touched the fabric and a chill ran through me, like a warning or perhaps an invitation. I could sense the stories embedded in each stitch, the moments of hope, the moments of despair, and the moments where the line between life and death had blurred. In the study beyond the bedrooms, I discovered more evidence of the family's futile attempts to understand and escape death. Papers were strewn across the desk, diagrams of the house, family trees with lines crossed out in frustration, and detailed accounts of illnesses, accidents, and sudden death. One particularly detailed record caught my attention: the account of a young heir who had vanished on the night of his 12th birthday. The entry described his disappearance in clinical, detached language, yet the undertone of fear and guilt was unmistakable. The family had tried to rationalize the unexplainable, to assign cause to events that defied logic, yet each entry ended the same way, with an ominous warning, ink smudged by hurried hands: "The house does not forgive." I could feel the presence of the family more acutely in this room. Their despair, their panic, their futile efforts, all seemed concentrated here, and I was acutely aware that I was intruding. The curse did not tolerate witnesses, and I was no longer merely observing history. I was becoming a part of. The air thickened, and I could hear the subtle creak of the floorboards, though no one else was there. Shadows shifted, moving independently of the light, and I understood that the house itself was alive in a sense that went beyond the physical. It remembered, it resented, and it exacted consequences. I found a drawer with letters, tied with ribbons that had long since lost their color. One letter, dated more than a century ago, described a family meeting in which the patriarch insisted on investigating the origin of the curse. They had summoned a so-called expert, a man who claimed knowledge of ancient rites and dark legacies. The letter recounted the experiment with meticulous care, but the outcome was devastating. 2 members of the family fell ill mysteriously, one vanished entirely, and the patriarch himself grew weak and feverish before dying within a week. The letter ended with a chilling admonition: "Do not try to understand what you cannot change."
It became clear to me that the Kingsleys had been trapped in a cycle of fear, curiosity, and inevitable catastrophe. Every attempt to uncover the truth had only intensified the curse, binding it tighter to the family line. I began to feel the same tension, the same irresistible pull toward understanding, knowing that I too was walking the edge of disaster. My hands shook as I placed the letter back in the drawer, the sense of unseen eyes upon me almost unbearable. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, and I felt an inexplicable sense of urgency. The house seemed to pulse with life, as if aware of the approaching night and the opportunities it provided to assert its dominion. I understood then that the curse was most potent under the cover of darkness, when the human mind was weakest, and the veil between the living and the past was thinnest. I resolved to leave the bedrooms and retrace my steps toward the central hall, but the corridors had shifted. Doors that had once been behind me were gone, replaced by walls that seemed to breathe, closing in. Panic rose, but I forced myself to focus, aware that fear was exactly what the curse desired. It was in that moment of disorientation that I noticed a faint glow emanating from beneath a door at the far end of the corridor. I approached cautiously, my heart hammering in my chest. The light was soft, almost inviting, yet it carried a weight that pressed upon my very soul. The door creaked open with a gentle push, revealing a small chamber filled with artifacts I could not recognize. Ancient symbols carved into stone, ceremonial objects arranged in deliberate patterns, and faint traces of ash scattered across the floor. I sensed that this room was a nexus of the curse, the place where the family's misfortunes had been most concentrated, and where the true nature of the Kingsley legacy might finally be revealed. I stepped inside, aware that each movement was significant, each choice could be irreversible. The air was thick with anticipation, charged with the energy of generations who had suffered, resisted, and ultimately succumbed. I knew that to stay here, to continue my exploration, was to confront the curse directly. And yet, I could not turn back. Not now, not when so much had already been revealed. The Kingsley curse was a living entity, and I had stepped into its domain willingly, driven by a mixture of fear, fascination, and the need to understand. As the night deepened, I realized that the estate itself was a labyrinth of memory and pain, a place where time folded upon itself, and where the past, present, and future coexisted in a tense, unyielding balance. The whispers had grown into a chorus, not just voices, but a symphony of despair and warning, guiding me, testing me, preparing me for the revelations yet to come. I could feel the weight of history pressing down, yet I also sensed the faintest glimmer of hope, the possibility, however slim, that understanding the curse might offer some measure of liberation. The chamber awaited, the artifacts beckoning with quiet insistence. I knew that the next steps would be critical, and that the curse, patient and relentless, would not allow missteps. I drew a deep breath, steadying myself, aware that the rest of the story, the rest of the Kingsley tragedy, was poised to unfold, and that I was both observer and participant in a history that had refused to remain buried. The chamber was darker than I expected once the door closed behind me. Shadows pooled in the corners, thick and almost tangible, as if the house itself had exhaled a sigh of satisfaction, or perhaps of warning. The objects arranged in the center of the room drew my attention immediately. A circle of stones, each etched with symbols that twisted and turned in ways my mind could barely comprehend. Ash clung to the floor around them, gray and fine, like the remnants of a fire long extinguished, but never truly dead. I knelt to inspect one of the stones, brushing away the dust carefully, aware that these artifacts were not mere relics. They were conduits, a link between the Kingsley family and the curse that had defined their lineage. There were papers as well,
brittle sheets covered in jagged handwriting, diagrams of rituals, and strange incantations. As I tried to make sense of them, the words seemed to shift under my gaze, almost alive, challenging my comprehension. The deeper I read, the more I realized that these rituals were never meant to protect, but to binding the family to a destiny that could not be escaped. A diagram depicted a series of concentric circles, marking the body of the house itself, with the family's initials inscribed at critical points. It was as though the curse had been carefully planned, engineered over generations, each ritual adding weight to a legacy of suffering. I moved to a table at the far end of the chamber, where a small chest lay. The chest was locked, the key long missing, or perhaps never present at all. I could sense the importance of what lay inside, the final pieces of a puzzle that had claimed Kingsley after Kingsley. My hands hovered over the chest, trembling, but a strange compulsion urged me to open it. When the lid finally creaked back, I found a collection of personal items, a locket, a ring, letters, and a journal belonging to the patriarch, who had first recorded the curse in painstaking detail. The journal was unlike anything I had read before. It was not written in chronological order, nor did it attempt to explain itself logically. Instead, it was a tapestry of fear, foresight, and fragmented prophecy. The author described events that had already happened with chilling precision, as though he were recounting them for someone who had no choice but to witness the horror. He wrote of illnesses that appeared overnight, of sudden accidents that defied explanation, of arguments that ended with inexplicable deaths. And beneath it all, the constant refrain, "This is the house, this is the curse. You may try, but you cannot escape." I felt a shiver pass through me. As I read, the words were not mere descriptions, they were warnings, a guide for those who dared to enter the house and try to understand the forces at play. The patriarch had attempted to confront the curse, to document it, perhaps in hopes that knowledge alone could break it. But as I read further, I understood that knowledge was a double-edged sword here. It illuminated the horrors, but it also drew them close. Every detail the patriarch recorded, every attempt to explain, had only strengthened the connection between the house and the family. The locket in the chest caught my eye. Inside was a small portrait of a young woman, her eyes wide with innocence, framed by a delicate gold filigree. I felt the weight of her gaze, as if she were imploring me to understand the gravity of what I had uncovered. Her name was inscribed on the back, Elizabeth Kingsley. I flipped through the letters and found correspondence addressed to her, written in trembling script. The letters spoke of fear, of secrets hidden in the walls, and of family members who had vanished without explanation. Each word dripped with anxiety, the echoes of terror, reaching across decades to imprint themselves on my own consciousness. It became apparent that the curse was not merely supernatural, but psychological, emotional, and physical, entwined with every choice the family had made. Each generation had attempted to resist it, some through reason, others through denial, and some through outright rebellion. But the house, the documents, and the artifacts bore silent testimony that resistance was futile. Every attempt to escape, to alter the path laid out for them, had only reinforced the inexorable chain of events. A sudden noise startled me, a soft whisper, barely audible, like someone breathing on the edge of hearing. I froze, heart hammering. The shadows seemed to shift in response, stretching longer, darker, as though the house itself were alive and aware of my intrusion. I realized then that I was no longer merely observing the curse from a distance. My presence here, my curiosity, my very attempt to understand it had been anticipated. The house had been waiting for someone like me, someone willing to dig into its history, someone willing to confront what had been buried. I stepped back from the chest, feeling a cold draft that carried the faint scent of smoke and decay. The walls of the chamber seemed to hum softly, a vibration that resonated in my bones. It was as though the house were reminding me of the boundaries I had crossed, the dangers I had ignored, and the consequences that might follow. I understood that the curse was not passive. It was vigilant, sentient in its own terrifying way, and wholly uninterested in mercy. In that moment, I knew that I had a choice to make. I could leave, turn away from the chamber, and attempt to escape the house while the shadows were distracted, or I could continue, delve deeper, and risk everything in pursuit of knowledge that might consume me entirely. The weight of the Kingsley legacy pressed down, heavy with expectation, warning, and inevitability. Yet, despite the fear, a part of me, perhaps the same part that had compelled generations of Kingsleys to investigate, to document, to resist, urged me onward. As I turned to leave the chamber, I glanced once more at the circle of stone. The symbols seemed to shimmer faintly in the dim light, as though responding to my gaze. The realization struck me with sudden clarity. The curse was not confined to the family alone. It was in the house, in the artifacts, in the very fabric of the estate. It would continue, generation after generation, until someone or something broke the cycle. And now, by being here, by reading, touching, and witnessing, I had become part of that chain. I left the chamber with a sense of dread that weighed on every step. The corridors seemed longer now, more labyrinthine, as if the house itself were guiding me, testing me, preparing me for what was to come. I knew that the most profound revelations, the truths behind the Kingsley curse, were yet to be revealed, and I understood with stark clarity that I could never return to the world as I had known it. The house, the family, the curse, they were now inextricably intertwined with my own story. The morning after my discovery in the chamber, I awoke to a world that seemed familiar, yet undeniably altered. Light fell through the high windows in thin golden slivers, yet even this brightness seemed tainted by shadow, as though the house itself had infused the very air with the weight of its secrets. I moved through the halls, each step echoing ominously, and noticed the walls were not as I remembered. Faint etchings traced their surfaces, markings that hadn't been there before. They were subtle, almost imperceptible, like whispers frozen in plaster, yet they carried meaning, an indication that the house itself had begun to respond to my presence, to the knowledge I had uncovered in the forbidden chamber. I returned to the main hall, seeking comfort in the ordinary architecture, the grand staircase, the ornate banisters, the polished wood reflecting fragments of sunlight. But the familiarity only made the strangeness more pronounced. There were signs that someone or something had moved here during the night. Dust disturbed, faint footprints not quite human, a shadow flickering at the edge of vision. It was as if the house had awakened, no longer content to remain a passive vessel for the Kingsley curse, but now actively engaged in its own dark design. I tried to ground myself in the stories I had read in the patriarch's journal, attempting to piece together the nature of the curse. It became increasingly clear that it was not a singular event, not a singular act of malevolence, but a tapestry woven over centuries. Each Kingsley had contributed a thread, willingly or unknowingly, through their choices, their betrayals, and their misdeeds. The curse was not merely about punishment, it was about legacy, an inheritance more binding than any will, more permanent than any name. And now I realized with an unsettling certainty, I had become part of that legacy. The letters I had found in the chest revealed glimpses of family members who had resisted the curse in ways both ingenious and tragic. One described a plan to flee the estate entirely, moving across continents in an attempt to sever the bond. Another spoke of attempts to destroy the artifacts, to burn the journals, to shatter the stones, yet each endeavor ended in failure. Thwarted by misfortune or accident, death had a way of finding those who tried to escape, and the house seemed to act as a silent accomplice, ensuring that the cycle remained unbroken. I wandered into the library, seeking some measure of rationality in the midst of chaos. Rows upon rows of books lined the walls, many untouched for decades. Their spines faded, pages yellowed. I pulled one from the shelf at random, a treatise on local history, and began to read, hoping to find corroboration for the events described in the journal. But even here, the mundane text seemed to pulse with the house's influence. Names shifted as I read, dates blurred, and passages describing ordinary occurrences took on a sinister tone. I realized then that the curse's reach extended beyond the family, Beyond the walls it permeated knowledge itself, twisting perception, bending understanding, and warping reality to its will. As the day wore on, I heard voices, soft murmuring, almost hypnotic. They came from the walls, from the corners of rooms, from the very floorboards beneath my feet. The voices were a mixture of fear, warning and entreaty, a chorus of Kingsleys past and present, bound to the house by the I could not make out the words, yet the tone conveyed desperation, a plea to those who entered to turn back, to resist the compulsion to uncover what should remain hidden. But the compulsion was irresistible. Curiosity had become a tether, drawing me deeper into the history, the terror, and the inevitability that defined the Kingsley bloodline. In the afternoon, I discovered a hidden staircase leading to the attic, previously unknown to me. The air grew colder with each step, a biting chill that seemed to strip warmth from my body. At the top, the attic was vast, filled with relics, forgone furniture, and trunks overflowing with clothing and possessions that had belonged to generations long dead. It was a museum of lives once lived, now frozen in time, yet charged with an uncanny vitality. I approached a trunk, its surface scarred and worn, and opened it to reveal a collection of masks, ceremonial, grotesque, and intricately detailed. The masks seemed to watch me, their painted eyes glinting in the dim light. They were remnants of rituals, protective and restrictive alike, each tied to a particular family member's attempt to negotiate the curse, to control it, or to hide from it. One mask, larger than the rest, bore the unmistakable insignia of the first patriarch, the founder of the family's ill-fated lineage. As I held it in my hands, a wave of vertigo struck me, a dizzying sensation that threatened to unmoor me from reality. Images flashed behind my eyelids, feasts, arguments, sudden illnesses, unexplained deaths, shadows stretching across generations. I realized that the mask was not just an object, but a vessel of memory, capturing the pain, fear, and desperation of all who had worn it before. The inheritance of suffering was literal, and by touching it, I had temporarily absorbed a fraction of that legacy. I sank to the floor, gasping for breath, and became acutely aware of the house's presence. The attic, the library, the chamber below, they were all interconnected, nodes in a web of influence and malevolence that the Kingsleys had never fully understood. The curse was no longer just a story or a warning. It was alive, aware, and responsive. My own thoughts, my heartbeat, even my intentions seemed to reverberate through the walls. I was both observer and participant, and the distinction between the two had blurred. By evening, exhaustion weighed heavily upon me, yet sleep was impossible. The house had claimed my attention entirely, filling my mind with images, sounds, and sensations that defied explanation. I realized that to survive, to retain any semblance of autonomy, I would need to confront the curse directly, to understand its mechanisms, and perhaps to find a way to break the chain that had bound the Kingsleys for centuries. But even as I resolved to do so, a part of me feared that knowledge alone might be insufficient, that the house had anticipated every move, every thought, every attempt at defiance. And so, I prepared myself to descend once more into the depths of the estate, determined to continue the search for truth, yet aware that each discovery brought with it a greater burden. The Kingsley family's history was no longer a distant tale. It was my present, my responsibility, and possibly my undoing. Every corridor, every chamber, every shadowed corner whispered a single, unyielding truth. The curse was real. It was relentless, and it would not be denied.
Night had fallen by the time I decided to leave the attic. Darkness crept across the estate like a living thing, seeping under doors, through cracks in the walls, and curling into every corner of the house. The faint flicker of candlelight I carried seemed almost insufficient, a fragile barrier against the oppressive blackness that seemed determined to swallow me whole. Each step I took down the hidden staircase felt heavier than the last, as though the house itself resisted my movement, pressing against me with the weight of centuries of accumulated dread. I reached the main hall and paused, listening to the eerie silence. The house had grown quieter, but the absence of sound was almost worse than its presence. a hollow echo of life long extinguished. The shadows appeared thicker, darker, and more alive, as if they were aware of my every motion, tracking me with patience and intention. My mind raced with the possibilities of what lay ahead, each thought tinged with fear. What if the next discovery revealed something too horrifying to endure? What if my presence here triggered consequences that could no longer be undone? Yet, some part of me knew I could not turn back. Knowledge demanded sacrifice, and I had already begun paying its price. I made my way to the library, hoping the familiar rows of books might provide some clarity. But the room seemed different in the moonlight, transformed from a place of study into a labyrinth of shadows and half-seen forms. Dust motes danced in the air, illuminated by the pale glow, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. I felt the unmistakable sense of being watched, as though unseen eyes were observing my every choice, waiting to see if I would falter. The family portraits on the walls appeared more lifelike than ever, their painted eyes glinting with a strange, accusing light. Generations of Kingsleys stared at me, their silent judgment palpable, reminding me that the curse was not merely an abstract force, it was personal, intimate, and unforgiving. As I examined the shelves, I discovered a leather-bound journal I had not noticed before. Its cover was cracked, worn, and blackened at the edges, and a faint scent of decay emanated from it. I opened it carefully, revealing the spidery handwriting of a long-dead Kingsley. The words spoke of attempts to bargain with the forces behind the curse, of prayers whispered into corners of empty rooms, and rituals performed under the guise of tradition. Each entry detailed the hopelessness of these efforts, describing misfortune that escalated, rather than abated, with every attempt to defy the family's fate. I realized, with a shiver, that those who tried to cheat the curse often brought it closer to themselves, accelerating its reach rather than diminishing it. Hours passed as I pored over the journal, uncovering layer after layer of history. I learned of marriages arranged to appease spirits, secret rooms built to hide dangerous artifacts, and nightly vigils maintained to prevent the curse from gaining momentum. Every Kingsley had a strategy, but each strategy had failed in its own way. The more I read, the more I understood that the curse was not just punishment. It was a test, an intricate system designed to probe weaknesses, to exploit pride, fear, and greed, and to ensure that the family could never escape its own shadow. The journal mentioned a particular event that had been recorded in hushed tones, a midnight gathering in the estate's gardens, where members of the family attempted a ceremony to cleanse their bloodline. According to the text, the ritual had been incomplete, disrupted by a sudden storm that seemed unnatural in its intensity. Lightning had struck the old oak at the center of the grounds, splitting it down the middle. Those present had vanished, leaving only traces of blood, scorched earth, and a lingering sense of dread. I felt a chill at the thought that the remnants of this failed attempt might still linger, the earth itself keeping a memory of violence and desperation that refused to fade with time. Determined to uncover more, I left the library and made my way to the gardens. Moonlight bathed the grounds in silver, casting long, spindly shadows from twisted trees and overgrown hedges. The air was thick with the scent of earth, decay, and something more subtle, an undertone of iron, of life drained too soon. I approached the old oak described in the journal, its trunk split and scarred, and noted strange markings carved into the bark. They resembled runes, but they were unfamiliar, warped by time and weather, almost impossible to decipher. I traced a finger along one of the grooves, and felt a pulse, a vibration beneath my touch, that resonated with a deep ancient energy. It became clear that the curse was tied not only to the family, but to the land itself. The estate was a living instrument of the Kingsleys' fate, its soil, trees, and stones acting in concert to enforce the ancient pact. I wondered if my intrusion had awakened something, if the very act of reading and observing had allowed the curse to extend beyond its traditional boundaries. My thoughts were interrupted by a rustling sound from the hedges. I froze, straining to see through the darkness. A figure emerged, tall, indistinct, and swaying as if moved by wind or intention. My heart pounded. I thought at first it might be a wild animal, yet the form seemed to have purpose,
deliberate movement and awareness. The figure stopped several yards away, its outline sharp against the moonlight. I could not see a face, only the suggestion of eyes reflecting the dim glow. A wave of recognition passed through me, inexplicable yet undeniable. I understood, somehow, that this entity was connected to the Kingsley curse, that it was both guardian and enforcer, bound to the estate and the family's history. I realized then that my next steps would be crucial. One misstep could bind me permanently to this force, integrating me into the cycle I had spent hours trying to comprehend. I drew a deep breath, steadying myself, and moved closer. The figure did not flee, nor did it approach. It simply waited, as if gauging my intention. I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper, recounting what I had learned, what I understood, and what I feared. Silence followed, a silence that pressed against me like water against a sunken ship. Then slowly the figure tilted its head, and I felt a pulse of energy ripple through the garden. It was a warning, a challenge, and perhaps an invitation. The night stretched endlessly before me, and I understood, with stark clarity, that the journey to unravel the Kingsley curse was only beginning, that the forces arrayed against me were patient, relentless, and intimately aware of every thought I harbored. The following day dawned gray and oppressive, the clouds hanging low, as if weighed down by the estate's history. I had spent the night tossing and turning in a guest room I barely recognized as mine. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward me, whispering fragments of warnings I couldn't fully grasp. The house was alive with murmurs, each creak and sigh of wood a reminder that the Kingsleys' legacy had no interest in quietude. My unease grew into a gnawing certainty. The curse had begun to notice me, and it would not allow intrusion without consequence. Determined to proceed, I ventured back into the West Wing, where family portraits lined the walls like sentinels, their eyes following my every step. I studied each painting carefully, looking for anomalies, symbols, anything that might indicate which members had suffered the worst of the curse's wrath. Faces that once seemed composed now looked twisted in subtle ways, the eyes too wide, the mouths too thin, the posture unnaturally rigid. It was as if the artists had captured not merely likenesses, but the essence of suffering, recording a truth too sinister for words. In a far corner of the wing, behind a faded tapestry depicting a hunting scene, I discovered a door I had never noticed before. Its wood was darkened with age, the iron handle cold and heavy under my grip. Hesitation surged, yet curiosity pushed me forward. I turned the key I had found in the attic months ago, a key etched with the same runes I had traced on the old oak tree. The lock gave way with a reluctant click, revealing a hidden chamber suffused with shadows. The air smelled of damp stone and centuries of forgotten secrets. I stepped inside cautiously, feeling the oppressive weight of history pressing against my shoulder. The room was small, circular, and lined with shelves, holding a mixture of tomes, jars, and trinkets. Candles had been long extinguished, but the residue of wax and soot marked the places where rituals had been performed. On a pedestal in the center rested a single object, a silver chalice, tarnished with age, its surface engraved with intricate patterns. I approached it, sensing a palpable energy radiating from the metal. The chalice had belonged to the family's most desperate attempt to control the curse, an instrument meant to draw the power into a vessel, allowing them to manipulate it. The journal had hinted at its existence, but nothing had prepared me for the aura of menace that emanated from it now. I touched the chalice lightly, and the room seemed to exhale, a windless breath that rustled my hair and lifted the dust in spiraling pattern. Images flashed in my mind. Ancestors gathered around the pedestal chanting incantations, faces pale with fear, hands trembling, spilling their blood in vain attempts to subdue a force beyond comprehension. I saw moments of horror, repeated across generations, lives cut short, inheritances squandered, sanity unraveling, all tied to this single object, and the dark will it contained. A noise drew my attention to the corner of the room. A small chest, hidden beneath a faded tapestry, caught my eye. Its lock was simple, but as I knelt to open it, a tremor ran through the floor. I paused, hand hovering over the keyhole. The sense of being observed intensified. Shadows seemed to crawl along the walls, and the temperature dropped sharply. Breathing became a conscious effort, each inhale thick with fear. Gathering my courage, I unlocked the chest and lifted the lid. Inside lay documents, letters and fragments of diary entries, all brittle with age. They recorded the Kingsleys' most private transactions, alliances, betrayals, and rituals performed in secret. Names I had seen in portraits came to life in their own handwriting, confessing fears they never spoke aloud, describing unnatural occurrences that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. One entry detailed a night when multiple family members disappeared into the estate's underground passages and never returned. Another described the sudden death of a child after an obscure ceremony went wrong. Every piece fit together, painting a picture of relentless misfortune, of a family trapped in a cycle of their own making, unable to escape the consequences of choices made generations before. I realized then that understanding the curse was more than academic. It demanded participation, observation, and risk. I could read every journal, examine every artifact, and trace every symbol, but the essence of the curse was still alive, still aware, still patient. It required not just attention but acknowledgement, a recognition of its presence and power. The family had tried to hide it, to bargain with it, to ignore it, but it thrived in exposure. By entering the chamber, by touching the chalice, by reading the words left behind, I had become a part of that continuum. Hours passed, unnoticed, as I delved into the documents. Outside, the sky darkened further, the first drops of rain beginning to fall. I heard the distant roll of thunder, though the clouds above the estate were thin and ragged. It was as though the storm itself responded to the awakening I had inadvertently caused, an atmospheric echo of the curse's growing awareness. I could not leave the room, could not ignore the pull of the chalice and the documents. I felt the eyes of long-dead Kingsleys on me, judging, observing, test. My heartbeat thrummed in my ears, as I understood the enormity of what lay before me. The curse was not merely historical, it was immediate, demanding attention, comprehension, and respect. Finally, as night deepened, I stepped back from the pedestal. The chalice seemed to dim, the oppressive energy in the room, receding slightly though not gone. I understood that I had survived this encounter by careful observation, by patience, and perhaps by the recognition that I was not here to manipulate or destroy, but to wit. The curse had not been fooled, but it had acknowledged me, and that acknowledgement carried both peril and promise. Peril because the estate would not forgive ignorance or arrogance, promise because knowledge, once earned, could be wielded carefully, guiding decisions in ways past generations could not. I left the hidden chamber with a sense of cautious determination. Every step through the west wing was measured, aware that the house itself might shift, rearrange, or resist my movement. Yet beneath the fear was a thread of clarity. I was beginning to understand the mechanisms of the curse, the patterns of misfortune, the interplay of history, magic, and mortality that had bound the Kingsley family for centuries. It would take courage, precision, and vigilance to navigate the coming trials, but for the first time, I felt a faint, stubborn hope. Perhaps understanding could carve a path through the darkness, a path that might one day lead to freedom. The night after discovering the hidden chamber, sleep proved impossible. I lay in the dimly lit guest room, staring at the ceiling, hearing the house settle, groan, and sigh around me. The Kingsley estate was alive in ways I could no longer ignore. Every shadow seemed to shift with intention. Every creak of the floorboards a message I was only beginning to interpret. Even the rain against the windows seemed purposeful, tapping patterns I could not yet decipher. My mind, though exhausted, refused to yield to rest. Fragments of letters, images of the chalice, and visions of past ceremonies danced endlessly in my imagination. At dawn, I returned to the estate's main hall, walking deliberately, trying to regain some measure of calm. The portraits of my ancestors, those same faces that had haunted me since my arrival, seemed now to regard me with more than mere observation. There was a challenge in their gaze, a silent demand that I understand the full weight of what had come before. I approached the largest portrait, that of Richard Kingsley, the patriarch responsible for the initial ritual that had unleashed the curse centuries ago. The eyes were unsettlingly lifelike, the dark pupils reflecting the flickering morning. I felt compelled to speak aloud, as though uttering the words might summon a response. "I am here to understand," I whispered, "not to repeat your mistakes, not to take what is not mine, only to learn." A cold draft brushed my neck, and for a moment, the hairs on my arms stood on end. I could not tell whether the sensation came from the house, or from the weight of history pressing down on me. There was no response, yet the room felt altered, more alive, more aware. almost sentient. I realized then that the estate had acknowledged my presence in the hidden chamber, and now it awaited my next moves. Every step forward carried risk, but also the potential for revelation. I moved toward the library, the heart of knowledge within the Kingsley estate. The shelves were filled with books both mundane and arcane, journals stacked alongside treatises on medicine, philosophy, and ritual magic. I pulled volumes at random, skimming passages that referenced the curse in oblique terms. Every text hinted at the family's desperate attempts to manipulate fate, to bend fortune to their will. The more I read, the clearer it became. The curse had always been adaptive, responding to attempts at control with increasingly severe consequences. Any action taken without understanding would only deepen the entanglement. Hours passed as I cross-referenced entries, traced lineages, and noted patterns. The curse did not discriminate. It acted like a force of nature, indifferent to guilt or innocence. Entire branches of the family had been extinguished in single nights, while others had survived only to pass the burden silently to their children. It became evident that the chalice I had seen in the hidden chamber was not merely symbolic. It was a focal point, a tool designed to channel or contain the force that had taken root. Yet even in their most sophisticated efforts, the Kingsleys had failed. The artifact could not eliminate the curse. It could only delay, contain, or redirect it, temporarily shaping the outcomes of their misfortune. A noise drew my attention, a soft scratching at the far end of the library. I froze, heart pound. The sound persisted, rhythmic and deliberate, like fingernails tracing the wood of a distant desk. I crept toward the source, senses alert, every nerve on fire. Behind a stack of leather-bound volumes, I found a small trapdoor, one I had never noticed before. It was roughly hewn, the edges worn by repeated use over centuries. The scratching had come from beneath it, as though something or someone was trapped, clawing to be heard. I hesitated, aware that whatever lay beyond might be a revelation or a trap. I had learned caution over the past days. This house did not forgive impulsivity, yet curiosity demanded action. I opened the trapdoor slowly, the hinges protesting with a sharp squeal. A narrow passage led downward into darkness, the air thick and musty. The scent of damp earth and decay rose to greet me, accompanied by the faint metallic tang of iron. I could see nothing beyond the first few steps, yet I felt an undeniable pull, as though the passage itself wanted me to descend.
I fetched a lantern from the hall and lit it, the flame flickering as I moved. Shadows danced along the rough walls, creating shapes that seemed almost human, shifting with a life of their own. I descended carefully, each footstep deliberate, aware that any misstep could be disastrous. The passage widened into a cavernous space, lined with stone shelves and niches. Strange artifacts filled these spaces, old masks, dried herbs, skeletal fragments, and objects that defied immediate recognition. Some radiated an unsettling aura, making my skin crawl. I realized that the family had not merely recorded their attempts to contain the curse, they had concealed its most dangerous instruments here, hoping to keep them away from prying eyes. At the center of the cavern was a stone altar, etched with the same symbols I had seen on the chalice. A dark stain marred its surface, centuries old, but fresh to the eye. The air was heavy with anticipation, the silence broken only by the drip of water from unseen cracks above. I understood instinctively. This was the locus of the Kingsley curse, the point at which their fates had been twisted and from which the cycle had perpetuated itself. My presence here was not accidental. The estate had led me to this space, compelling me to confront the very heart of the darkness that had governed generations. I knelt beside the altar, examining the markings. Their meaning became clearer with each passing moment, a language of power, fear, and consequence. The ritual had been designed to bind a force larger than the family itself, an entity that had existed long before the Kingsleys and would endure long after. The chalice, the hidden chamber, the labyrinthine passages, all were extensions of a strategy that had failed repeatedly. Understanding this, I realized might offer a way forward, not to destroy the curse, but to navigate it, to anticipate its movements, and perhaps to survive it. Hours passed as I documented every symbol, every artifact, and every inscription. My hands grew raw, my eyes strained, yet I felt a growing sense of mastery. Knowledge, I understood, was the only weapon against a force as ancient and indifferent as the Kingsley curse. The estate had tested my patience, my courage, and my resolve. I had emerged with fragments of understanding, each one a step towards survival, and as I ascended the passage, back into the library, the estate seemed to exhale, acknowledging my progress. I was no longer merely a visitor. I had become a participant in a story centuries in the making, bound to the same rhythms of fear, consequence, and revelation that had governed the family for generations. The days that followed my descent into the hidden cavern were disorienting. The estate seemed to have shifted, subtly, as though my understanding of its hidden passages and rituals had altered its very architecture. Hallways I had walked a dozen times now seemed longer, doors slightly out of place, and shadows that had been static now moved with intent. It was clear that the Kingsley estate was responsive, not just to presence, but to perception. I had been given access to knowledge, but with that came responsibility, and the house reminded me constantly that missteps had consequences. I spent hours reviewing my notes, sketches, and observations from the cavern. Every artifact, symbol, and text I had encountered hinted at a deeper network of power, one that had allowed the Kingsley family to manipulate outcomes, but never free themselves from the weight of their own misdeed. The curse, I realized, was not simply a punishment. It was a mirror, reflecting the desires, fears, and failures of each generation. To confront it directly would be to confront the darkest impulses within myself, and I was unprepared to do so blindly. Yet the estate would not let me remain passive. That evening, as the sun dipped behind distant hills, I heard whispers echoing through the main hall, not voices in the conventional sense, but a low, undulating murmur that carried meaning in pattern. I followed the sound, compelled despite my apprehension, to the chamber where the first revelations had occurred. There, a shadow moved, separate from the usual play of light and darkness. I froze, watching as a figure materialized, ephemeral yet unmistakably human. It was the likeness of a Kingsley ancestor, Lucian Kingsley, notorious for his ambition and ruthlessness. The specter's eyes glowed faintly, and though it did not speak, I felt a torrent of emotion: pride, anger, despair, and a desperate need for recognition. The entity gestured toward the stone altar I had studied, then pointed at me, demanding that I acknowledge both the weight of the curse and my place within the lineage of observers. I understood instantly that the house was testing me, seeking to measure my comprehension, my courage, and my resolve. I took a deep breath and addressed the apparition aloud. I see what was done, and I understand the cost. I will not seek to possess, only to learn. I will not attempt to control what is beyond me, only to endure it with knowledge as my guide. The shadow paused, its form flickering like a flame. For a long moment silence reigned, punctuated only by the faint creak of the estate. Then, gradually the figure dissipated, leaving a single residue of presence, a faint coldness that lingered in the air, a warning and a blessing intertwined. I realized that the house, and perhaps the curse itself, was acknowledging my intent. Knowledge and restraint could coexist, and that coexistence might be the key to navigating what had destroyed so many before me. The following morning, I explored the east wing of the estate, a portion I had previously avoided due to unsettling rumors. Dust-laden corridors stretched endlessly, lined with portraits, whose subjects seemed to watch my every step. Some of these faces were familiar, others unknown, their eyes following me with quiet accusation. The rooms themselves were filled with objects long forgotten, ornate furniture, ceremonial garments, and relics, whose purposes were obscure but undeniably significant. I catalogued everything meticulously,
aware that understanding required patience and precision. Among the artifacts, I discovered a journal belonging to Eleanor Kingsley, a figure largely erased from family histories due to scandal and misfortune. Her handwriting was elegant, precise, and full of urgency. She described attempts to negotiate with the forces bound to the family, to mitigate their impact through ritual, negotiation, and sacrifice. Yet even her detailed instructions ended abruptly, leaving gaps that hinted at events too horrifying to record fully. The texts conveyed a sense of inevitability. The Kingsleys could shape the curse only to the extent that it allowed, and their influence was always temporary, fleeting, and incomplete. Hours later, I was drawn to a section of the estate where the air was dense and cold, as though the temperature itself had been manipulated. A faint glow emanated from cracks along the floorboard. Kneeling, I pried open a small panel and found a cache of letters, each sealed in wax and marked with dates spanning generations. The correspondence revealed desperate attempts to warn descendants, instructions for safe passage, and admonitions against curiosity. Yet despite their meticulous planning, the letters also admitted failure. Every generation had been ensnared by the same patterns, unable to resist the allure of forbidden knowledge. I realized then that my role was unprecedented. I was not a Kingsley by blood, yet the estate had drawn me into its web. Perhaps it had sensed my capacity to observe without succumbing, to understand without attempting to dominate. I held the letters carefully, reading them over and over, each one reinforcing the lesson that knowledge must be tempered by caution, that power without comprehension is lethal, and that some secrets exist, not to be wielded but to be respected. As dusk fell, I returned to the hidden cavern. I wanted to cross-check my notes, ensure that my interpretations of the symbols and artifacts aligned with the historical record preserved in journals, letters, and inscriptions. The estate seemed calm, but I could feel its awareness, its subtle nudging, guiding me toward conclusions I might not have reached otherwise. The air was charged, each breath carrying the weight of centuries. I understood that my time in this place was temporary. I had been granted insight, but also a responsibility to leave, to document, and perhaps to warn those who might come after. Before leaving the cavern, I traced my fingers along the etchings on the stone altar, feeling the grooves and indentations that generations of Kingsleys had carved, and I would honor the lessons, respect the dangers, and preserve the record. Whether this would shield me entirely remained uncertain, but knowledge, I realized, was my only true defense. Emerging from the estate into the night, the moonlight washing over the hills, I sensed a shift in the air. The house, patient and eternal, seemed to acknowledge my resolve. I was leaving, but not as a victim. I had survived, not by avoiding danger, but by understanding it, by navigating the interplay of history, ritual, and consequence. The Kingsley curse would endure, as it had for centuries, but I carried with me the insight to face it, to respect it, and perhaps to escape it where others had failed. The night I left the Kingsley estate, the air felt unusually still, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The path down the hill was illuminated only by the silver sliver of moon, and the estate behind me loomed like a silent sentinel, its windows darkened but watching. I had spent weeks within its walls, tracing the steps of generations, understanding the rituals, the letters, the shadows that had haunted the Kingsleys. And now, with the knowledge I carried, I was acutely aware of the delicate balance between survival and doom. The journey back to the nearest village was long, the road winding and treacherous, but I felt compelled to move quickly. Every rustle of leaves, every distant cry, every shift of the wind seemed amplified, reminding me that the curse was not only a family's burden, it was the estate itself, sentient and unyielding. I kept the letters and journals close, as though they might shield me with their fragile authority, and in my mind, I replayed every lesson learned. The curse was not merely supernatural, it was psychological, historical, and moral. To ignore it was to invite disaster. To respect it was to survive. Upon reaching the village, I sought a place to rest. The innkeeper, a woman older than memory itself, regarded me with a mixture of curiosity and caution. I could feel her weariness, the faint tremor in her eyes, as though she had seen what I carried, or perhaps what I had become. I chose not to explain, merely requesting a room and a quiet corner. The walls, thin and papered with time, did little to keep the night at bay, but sleep came, however, fitfully, and with it, dreams steeped in the imagery of the estate. In my dreams, the Kingsleys appeared, each spectre distinct and clear. Lucian's eyes burned with ambition, Eleanor's sorrow pressed down like lead, and other ancestors whispered warnings I could not fully understand. Yet, in these visions, I also saw paths forward, decisions that could be made, knowledge that could be passed, patterns that could be broken. I awoke before dawn, heart racing, knowing that the final steps I would take were as crucial as any ritual, any interpretation of the symbols, any careful reading of the letters. I returned to the estate once more, not to explore, but to close what could be closed. I moved to the hidden cavern, placing the letters and journals back in their alcove, sealing them as best I could with knowledge of the correct sequence of stones and inscription. I recited the words Eleanor had documented, not as incantation, but as recognition, a respect for the generations who had suffered, learned and failed before me. Each syllable carried weight, and the air vibrated, alive with centuries of energy and memory. I felt the presence of the estate shift, subtle but undeniable, as if acknowledging that a chapter was ending. The estate did not release me entirely. As I walked through the hallways one last time, I could feel the traces of history embedded in every surface, the hand-carved railings, the portraits with eyes that seemed to follow, the chill that lingered in corners long after sunlight returned. I had learned to move through these spaces with humility, awareness, and caution, and now those qualities were my protection. It was not mastery, but survival, and that was enough. Emerging into the dawn, the estate receded behind me, bathed in early sunlight, less threatening, almost beautiful in its severity. The curse had not been lifted, it never would be, but I had achieved something rarer: comprehension. I understood its patterns, its demands, and its consequence. I knew that curiosity could be deadly, that ambition, without insight, was ruinous, and that knowledge tempered by restraint was the only safeguard. I walked through the village, the letters secured in my bag, my mind focused on the careful documentation of everything I had witnessed. Every detail mattered, every observation, and every interaction had to be recorded accurately. Future generations, whether scholars, descendants, or wanderers, needed the lessons the Kingsley estate had taught me. The curse was not just theirs, it was a warning, a moral, a narrative of consequence that extended beyond bloodlines. By midday, I had reached the edge of the forest that surrounded the estate, the sunlight piercing through branches and casting long shadows. I paused, feeling the weight of what I carried, the memories, the knowledge, the warnings, and I spoke softly to the wind. I will honor what I have learned. I will carry it carefully. I will not seek to repeat the mistakes of those who came before. The air shifted, faint but tangible, and I sensed a final acknowledgement from the estate itself. It would continue, ever present, but my understanding ensured that I could walk away alive and intact. The journey home was uneventful in comparison, the quiet roads and villages offering a reprieve from the oppressive atmosphere of Kingsley Hall. I spent the following weeks writing, cataloging and verifying every note, every observation. The house had taught me the danger of omission, as much as the danger of action. To misrecord, to misinterpret, to underestimate the gravity of the curse could lead to untold calamity. My writings became not just a record, but a manual, a testament to the balance between knowledge and humility. Finally, I sealed the final entries. I had completed what I could, honored what I had learned, and preserved the history of the Kingsley family for those who might one day seek it. The curse, relentless and eternal, would continue its work, but I had transcended its immediate grasp. Through understanding, patience, and reverence, I had transformed fear into clarity, obsession into comprehension, and horror into narrative. As I looked back one last time, The estate stood in the distance, imposing, enigmatic, and eternal. Its secrets were not mine to possess. Its curse was not mine to lift, but the knowledge I carried ensured that I had walked through darkness and emerged not as a victim, but as a witness, a chronicler, and a survivor. The Kingsley legacy was unbroken, yet its story had found a voice in me, a voice that would speak truthfully of the price paid, the lessons learned, and the shadows endured. I turned away, the sun warming my back, the path forward illuminated, and the weight of centuries finally resting, not on my shoulders, but in the understanding I had earned. The Kingsley estate receded, silent yet ever present, a monument to ambition, caution, and consequence. And I, at last, was free to live with the knowledge that curiosity, when tempered by wisdom, could survive even the darkest of legacies.
If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more mysteries that will keep you on the edge of your seat.